Word of the bizarre incident spread beyond the church before the day was over. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras ready, desperate to capture the story that seems stranger than fiction. Local news outlets broadcast breaking reports within hours. Man declared dead appears at his own funeral, wife dies in shock. The story went national within a day, sparking endless speculation across television, newspapers, and early online forums. People debated whether Richard had faked his death, whether the police had made a mistake, or whether something supernatural had unfolded inside that church. Authorities had no choice but to open a new investigation. The first mystery was the body found in the car crash. If Richard was alive, then who had been buried under his name? The corpse was exhumed, and forensic experts worked urgently to uncover the truth. Their findings only deepened the mystery. The burned body, initially identified as Richard because of items found in the wreckage, was not his at all. DNA testing revealed it belonged to an unidentified man with no records, no family connections, and no match in any database. It was as if the victim had appeared from nowhere, only to be consumed in flames that served another man's deception. As for Richard, his reappearance raised more questions than answers. He offered no detailed explanation for where he had been. He claimed vaguely that he had been traveling abroad on urgent business, and had lost all means of contacting anyone. Investigators quickly discovered that no travel records existed for him, no flights, no border crossings. His passport had not been used, his credit cards untouched, and yet here he was, alive. Neighbors who once admired the Harrisons now whispered about darker possibilities. Some insisted Richard had staged the crash to escape debts or crimes unknown to his wife. Others speculated about affairs, betrayal, or even ties to criminal networks. Rumors spread faster than facts, and the image of a respectable businessman crumbled into that of a man with dangerous secrets. Meanwhile, Margaret's family demanded justice. They were enraged that their grief had been compounded by deceit, that her final moments had been spent staring at the impossible. To them, Richard's presence at the funeral was not a miracle, but a cruel trick that had killed her. Their anger only fueled the public's obsession with the case. Despite the scrutiny, Richard remained oddly calm, as though detached from the chaos he had unleashed. His lack of emotion unsettled everyone around him. To some, it was proof of guilt. To others, it was evidence that something unexplainable was at work. Was he a man who had orchestrated the perfect disappearance, or a victim of some larger conspiracy? The truth was murky, and every new discovery seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The story had begun as a tragic accident, but by the end of that week it had become a nationwide mystery, one that would only grow stranger with each passing day. As investigators dug deeper into Richard Harrison's life, the image of a hardworking, respectable businessman quickly began to unravel. At first, they focused on the supposed accident, determined to understand how a body that did not belong to him had been misidentified as his. Forensic analysis revealed unsettling details. The burned corpse in the wrecked vehicle had not died from the crash itself, but showed evidence of blunt force trauma. Before the fire, it was clear the man had been killed before the vehicle went up in flames, which meant the crash was no accident, but a carefully constructed stage to convince everyone Richard was dead. Attention then shifted to Richard's finances. What they discovered shocked even the seasoned detectives working the case. Large sums of money had quietly disappeared from his business accounts in the months leading up to his alleged death. Several offshore transfers were traced to secret accounts under false names, each one meticulously hidden from both his wife and business partners. Investigators realized Richard had been preparing for a vanishing act, carefully laying the groundwork to escape his life, while leaving behind no trace of his true destination. Interviews with those who had known him painted a troubling picture. Colleagues described sudden tension in the office, unexplained absences, and an increasing distance between Richard and the company he had once managed closely. Some mentioned whispered arguments with unknown men who visited him late at night. Others spoke of suspicious new acquaintances with reputations tied to criminal networks. The more investigators learned, the clearer it became that Richard's life was not the respectable facade Margaret had believed in, but something tangled with lies, money, and possibly danger. The question that haunted everyone was why he had returned at all. If Richard had gone to such lengths to vanish, why would he appear so boldly at his own funeral? It seemed reckless, even self-destructive. Some speculated he had intended to shock everyone deliberately, a cruel performance to prove his cleverness. Others suggested that something had gone wrong in his plan, forcing him to re-emerge. There were whispers that he had been hiding from dangerous people, and that his reappearance was not by choice but desperation. The public was divided. To some, Richard was a criminal mastermind who had heartlessly faked his death and destroyed his wife in the process. To others, his story was evidence of something darker, a plot larger than one man's deceit. Margaret's sudden death at the exact moment she saw him only deepened the sense of mystery. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed she had been silenced by fear. Others believed Richard himself carried some unnatural curse. The media fed on the frenzy, publishing sensational headlines that blurred the line between fact and speculation. Detectives tried to press Richard for answers, but he remained evasive, offering vague statements about business troubles and personal struggles without ever addressing the real questions. He denied staging the crash, denied killing the man found in the wreckage, and denied stealing the money, yet evidence continued to mount against him. His demeanor unnerved everyone. Calm, cold, and detached, as if the chaos surrounding him was nothing more than background noise. The case grew heavier with each discovery, but the threads refused to tie neatly together. Who was the dead man in the car? Where had Richard been during the weeks he was presumed dead? Why had he chosen that precise moment to return, knowing the devastation it would cause? Each question opened another door, and none led to certainty. By the time weeks had passed, investigators were left with more mysteries than answers. Richard's story was no longer just about a man who had cheated death, but about a web of deceit that reached far beyond a single accident. And as suspicion grew, so did the sense that something far more dangerous was lurking beneath the surface. The investigation into Richard Harrison's shocking reappearance should have led to a trial, but instead it dissolved into uncertainty that left the case forever unsolved. After Margaret's death, he was taken into police custody, questioned for hours, and scrutinized by detectives and prosecutors alike. Yet despite the evidence of fraud, stolen money, and a staged crash, nothing tied him directly to the murder of the unidentified man found in the car. Without solid proof, the authorities faced the frustrating reality that they could not hold him for long. Still, they believed time was on their side, until Richard slipped through their grasp in the most unsettling way imaginable. It began with what seemed like a routine transfer. Richard was being moved from the police station to a secure facility for further questioning. When the transport van stopped at a red light on a quiet street, the officers inside reported nothing unusual, no signs of struggle, no alarms raised. Yet when they arrived at their destination minutes later, Richard was gone. The back doors were locked, the handcuffs left behind, and no trace of how he had vanished could be found. Witnesses along the road insisted they had never seen the doors open, nor had they seen anyone leave the vehicle. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. The escape only intensified the mystery. Some believed Richard had powerful accomplices who orchestrated the perfect extraction. Others were convinced his disappearance was something beyond human explanation. Conspiracy theories thrived. Government involvement, witness protection, or even supernatural intervention. The story of the man who returned from the dead now gained a darker layer. He had not only faked death, but somehow slipped beyond the reach of justice as well. Margaret's family, still grieving her sudden and tragic end, were left with more anger than closure. They demanded answers, filing lawsuits, calling for investigations, and pleading with the media to keep the story alive. To them, Richard was a murderer whose lies had destroyed their loved one. The image of Margaret collapsing at the sight of him haunted every article, every news broadcast, every conversation. She had lived her final moments staring at the impossible, and the pain of that truth never left those who loved her. In the weeks that followed, reported sightings of Richard surfaced from across the country. A man matching his description was seen boarding a bus in Chicago, dining at a roadside restaurant in Texas, and withdrawing cash from an ATM in Florida. None of these leads led to confirmation, and investigators began to wonder whether people were truly seeing him, or if the legend of his story was causing imaginations to run wild. Each new report blurred the line between reality and myth, keeping the public obsessed with his fate. As for the unidentified body in the burned car, it was never claimed. No family came forward, no missing person report matched, and no forensic database offered a match. The nameless victim was buried quietly, overshadowed by Richard's infamy. His identity, and the truth of how he became part of the staged crash, remains unknown to this day. He was the forgotten casualty of a mystery that never found resolution. Years passed, but the story never faded completely. Documentaries, podcasts, and endless articles kept the case alive. The church where Margaret collapsed remained a place of eerie curiosity, with locals whispering that her spirit lingered, searching for peace she had been denied. Some even claimed to see her shadow in the churchyard on quiet nights, a reminder of the moment when grief turned into horror. The legend of Richard Harrison became more than a true crime story. It became a chilling mystery of love, betrayal, and deception that blurred the line between life and death. To this day, no one knows why he returned to his own funeral, why he allowed his wife to see him, or why he disappeared again so completely. The unanswered questions keep the case alive in memory: a husband declared dead, a wife who died at the sight of him, and a truth buried deeper than any grave. Margaret Harrison had always believed her life was predictable, built on the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. She and her husband Richard lived in a modest, but comfortable house in a quiet Ohio suburb, a place where neighbors waved from their porches and children rode their bicycles in the streets without fear. To outsiders, theirs was a marriage built on stability and routine. Richard, a businessman often on the road, was seen as reliable and hardworking, while Margaret was the devoted wife who kept their home warm and welcoming. Their life was simple, perhaps even dull, but it was a life Margaret believed she could trust. That illusion shattered on a bitterly cold evening in late December. Margaret was preparing dinner when the knock came at the door. It was unusual for anyone to visit at that hour, and when she opened the door, two uniformed officers stood grim, faced in the yellow light of the porch. Their expressions alone told her something was terribly wrong before a single word was spoken. She felt her knees weaken as they explained that Richard had been killed in a violent car accident hours earlier. His vehicle had been discovered on a remote stretch of highway, engulfed in flames. The crash had been so severe that his body was badly burned, but personal items found inside confirmed the victim was him. The words struck Margaret like a physical blow. Her body shook as if the world itself had collapsed beneath her feet. Her ears rang, drowning out the officer's carefully chosen phrases. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked into nothingness. Richard, her Richard, the man she had shared her life with for nearly 2 decades, was gone in an instant. The thought of never seeing him again, never hearing his voice, never sharing another mundane morning over coffee, clawed at her chest until she could barely breathe. Grief consumed the days that followed. Margaret moved like a shadow through her home, disoriented by the silence left in Richard's absence. Friends and family came in waves, offering casseroles, prayers, and tearful embraces, but nothing could ease the hollow ache inside her. Every corner of the house reminded her of him. The jacket still draped over the chair, the unread book left on the nightstand, the faint scent of his cologne that lingered in the hallway. Nights were the worst, filled with endless hours of staring at the ceiling, replaying memories of the life they had built together, now reduced to ashes. The funeral was arranged swiftly, Though she was told the body was too damaged for an open casket, Margaret insisted on a proper service. It was what Richard deserved, she said through her sobs. The church was prepared with white lilies and tall candles, their light flickering softly against the stained glass windows. Relatives traveled from different states to be there, their black clothes blending into the dimly lit space. As if morning itself had a color, Margaret moved through it all in a fog, unable to fully comprehend the reality of what she was preparing to face. The morning of the funeral, she stood in front of her mirror, pale and trembling as she dressed in black. The woman staring back at her felt unrecognizable, aged overnight by sorrow. She whispered a prayer under her breath, asking for the strength to survive the day. All she wanted was closure, a final farewell, something to mark the end of Richard's story, and allow her to begin living in the ruins he left behind. Yet beneath the layers of grief, there was something Margaret couldn't name, a strange restlessness, a quiet doubt that stirred like a shadow in her chest. Something about the accident, about the way it had all happened, felt unreal to her. She dismissed the thought, forcing herself to focus on the ceremony that lay ahead. She told herself that once she saw the casket lowered into the ground, she would finally believe Richard was truly gone. What she could never have imagined was that the funeral she dreaded would not bring closure, but the beginning of a nightmare no one would ever forget. The day of the funeral arrived under a pale grey sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the earth and deepen the weight of sorrow. The church parking lot filled early as mourners dressed in black stepped quietly through the cold morning air. Inside, the scent of lilies mixed with candle wax, and the faint echo of the organ playing hymns. Every detail had been arranged with care, but the mood in the building was heavy, as though the walls themselves were grieving. Margaret sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes red and swollen from nights without rest. She had cried so much that her body felt drained, yet her mind would not stop spinning. The casket stood at the center of the altar, gleaming dark wood polished to a shine, its surface reflecting the dim light. It remained closed, and that alone unsettled Margaret. She had begged for one last glimpse of Richard, but the authorities had insisted it wasn't possible. The body, they said, was too badly burned to be remembered in that way. She tried to accept it, telling herself that the man she loved was gone, no matter what state his body had been left in. But the closed box in front of her felt like a wall, keeping her from truly saying goodbye. Relatives and friends whispered softly in the pews, sharing memories of Richard, stories of his laughter, his kindness, and his work ethic. Some dabbed their eyes with tissues while others stared blankly ahead, unable to process the suddenness of his death. The priest began to speak, offering words of comfort about the fragility of life and the hope of eternity. His voice echoed through the hall, steady and calm, but Margaret heard little of it. Her gaze never left the coffin. Something inside her seemed restless, as if her body was waiting for something she couldn't explain. She clutched her handkerchief tightly, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow. She thought of Richard's last day alive, trying to picture him driving down that lonely highway. She wondered if he had been afraid, if he had seen death coming in those final moments. The thought broke her, and she lowered her head, silently begging for strength to get through the next hour. It was then, in the middle of the priest's words, that the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church creaked open. The sound was faint, but it rippled through the room, pulling every eye toward the entrance. A man stepped inside, tall, dressed in a black suit, his face partly shadowed by the light behind him. At first, people assumed he was a late mourner, someone who had traveled far and only just arrived. But as he walked down the aisle, his features grew clearer, and the murmurs began. Gasps echoed through the pews, sharp and frightened. Some rose to their feet, others covered their mouths in disbelief. Margaret looked up, and her heart seemed to stop. The man walking toward her was Richard. Not a ghost, not a resemblance, but Richard himself, alive, moving, breathing, and staring directly at the coffin that was meant to hold him. The blood drained from Margaret's face. Her body turned cold, her mind unable to process the sight before her. For days she had been told he was dead, that the body in the wreckage was his, that she was a widow, yet here he was, alive, in flesh and bone, calmly entering his own funeral. Margaret's chest tightened violently, her heart hammering in terror and disbelief. She reached for the pew in front of her, her vision blurring, her breath breaking apart in shallow gasps. Her body gave way under the weight of the impossible truth. Within seconds, she collapsed, falling heavily to the ground as the church filled with screams. The guests rushed to her side, but her body remained still. The shock had been too much for her to survive. The man at the back, Richard, or someone who looked exactly like him, stopped walking and stood in silence as chaos erupted around him. The coffin, the prayers, the tears, all of it was now swallowed by the horror of one woman's final moment. Margaret's funeral had begun before Richard's had ever ended. The church became a storm of confusion after Margaret's collapse. What was meant to be a solemn farewell turned into a scene of chaos no one would ever forget. Some mourners rushed toward her, desperate to revive her, while others pulled back in fear, unable to comprehend the sight of Richard standing alive at the back of the room. The priest froze at the altar, clutching his Bible with trembling hands, while whispers grew into shouts and panicked cries. For many in the congregation, it felt as if they were witnessing something impossible, something that defied the very laws of life and death. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Margaret had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest, her heart unable to endure the overwhelming shock. As her body was carried out of the church, the air was heavy with disbelief and grief layered on top of grief. Some mourners wept uncontrollably, others fled the building, convinced they had seen a ghost. Yet Richard did not move. He sat quietly in one of the pews near the back, his expression unreadable, his presence chilling. He did not cry. He did not panic. He simply watched as the service unraveled around him.